In the middle of a wedding hall flooded with lights, when everyone still thought they were about to hear a blessing, my daughter-in-law turned around, called me by name, and smiled as if tidying things up neatly. She said I lived on useless delusions, that I was just a mental patient, standing in the wrong place, that I should not appear beside people considered decent. The words landed so softly they needed no raised voice, yet enough to still the entire hall for a beat, before laughter spread and phones lit up all at once, while my son, standing right beside her, only adjusted the lapel of his tuxedo, did not turn, did not object, as if that silence had been rehearsed. If you have ever been diminished in public in such a refined yet cruel way, have ever understood that a single well-placed sentence can turn you into entertainment for an entire room, and tell me where you are listening to this story from, and if you wish to continue alongside stories where the truth needs no noise yet still stands upright, I would value a follow. I stepped into the waterfront reception hall while the late light still clung to the bay, sliding slowly across floor-to-ceiling glass. Imported flowers rose into arches. The string ensemble drew rounded notes. Champagne fizzed in crystal flutes, catching light enough to make every smile look carefully positioned. This was a wedding with no empty space. Lights, blessings, gowns, applause. Everything filled the air in a prearranged order. Everyone who entered knew where they stood. I paused before the glass doors for a few beats. My reflection blended with the well-dressed figures inside. The dark blue suit had seen many seasons, the tailoring neat but no longer new. The shoes were carefully polished, clean enough not to mar the stone floor, old enough not to invite misunderstanding. I straightened my cuffs, took a short breath, and stepped through the revolving door. A practiced smile appeared at the reception desk. The attendant checked the name card, nodded quickly, courteous but efficient, as if everything had been set. I was guided along the edge of the hall, avoiding the main aisle where clusters of guests gathered. The band lifted a notch, laughter thickened, the scent of flowers grew heavier. My table sat near the service passage, where carts rolled softly by, where the lights were less generous, where important conversations did not stop. The chair already had someone seated, not a mistake. An auxiliary table, enough room for a few distant relatives, close enough to see the stage, far enough that no one would ask after me. The server drew out the chair slowly, placed the napkin, poured water, offered an automatic apology. I sat, rested my hands on the tabletop, and felt a surface cool and smooth enough to reflect both the lights and the invisible distance that had just been erected. At the head of the hall, Victoria stood up. The wedding gown fit close. The light chose her as its center. Her voice carried evenly, well-rounded, with a courtesy that made listeners nod before they had time to think. She began with thanks, spoke of family, of a journey, of the things that brought us here. Every sentence weighed, every pause perfectly timed. Then she shifted. "Adrian," she said, calling my name directly, her gaze pinning me like a prepared stamp, allowing no other interpretation. "He once pursued things that were very personal, things that exist only in his own imagination." She tilted her glass, her smile thin and sharp. "To be clear, that wasn't a career. That was delusion, the kind people usually attribute to a mental patient," she said, her voice still gentle, polite enough to avoid objection, yet clear enough to still the entire hall for a beat. "Now he lives a simple life, neatly fitted to his limits. My family believes everyone should be in the right place, and today we are merely returning things to where they belong." A ripple of curiosity spread quickly across the tables. A few phones were raised, then a few more, like a chain reaction, as if the room had just received a shared signal. Victoria smiled. The voice stayed soft, but the edge was unmistakable. She continued with phrases that sounded harmless. Different choices, different paths, accepting reality, stacking them one after another to lock in the meaning she had just thrown out. She did not need to raise her voice. The crowd already understood its role. A laugh broke out somewhere, short and clean, just enough to legitimize the looks converging on me. I heard it. I did not lower my head. I did not search for any eyes in the room. I kept my back straight, looking toward the stage where the light continued their story as if nothing needed to pause. At that moment, Evan stood beside Victoria. The tuxedo fitted perfectly, his posture precise, exactly where a groom newly granted ownership of the room should stand. As those words landed, Evan lifted a hand to adjust the button at his chest, a small, nearly instinctive gesture, happening at the exact moment the light swept past. My son did not look toward me. He did not need to. That gesture was enough to confirm that in this beat, he chose stillness to preserve his image intact. The silence did not come after deliberation. It arrived simultaneously with the insult, and because of that, it was colder. Near the service aisle, a staff member approached. My chair was nudged in a little farther. The distance between me and the walkway narrowed. A floor coordinator stood closer, not touching, merely present. No one gave orders. Everything moved by signal, by shared understanding. This was the order Victoria had just spoken of. At the head table, Richard Hale sat upright. His gaze swept the room and paused on me for a moment, so brief it could be missed without attention. He did not frown, did not nod. He maintained the calm of a man accustomed to controlling large boardrooms. I caught that look and returned it with a slight nod, just once, enough to confirm that we both understood where we stood on the board. Victoria continued her speech. She spoke of a new family, of chosen values, of cutting away what does not fit in order to move forward. The crowd received it with approving nods. Phones held their frames, focusing on smiles, on fabric, on what was deemed a memorable moment. At the edge of the frame, I sat still, like a background detail. When the band shifted keys, applause rose, covering every gap. I stood. I did not wait for attention. I pushed the chair in neatly, placed the napkin straight, stepped into the aisle. A few lenses followed. Light from the stage slid over my shoulder and fell to the floor, forming a short streak, just enough for those nearby to notice the movement. At the door I stopped. I turned back once more. Not searching, not reproaching, only remembering. Then I stepped outside, where the bay wind cooled the air, where the late light was fading. Behind me, the music continued. Phones lifted higher, out of habit not to miss a moment. On the glass, my reflection stretched, thin, then dissolved into darkness. Inside, the wedding ran smoothly, as if programmed, and I left with a nod, placed exactly where it belonged, and a silence that had just been handed to far too many people to hold. I did not leave the wedding with a sense of loss. What was left behind had been decided long ago. It was simply named correctly that night, in front of too many people. When the glass doors closed and the bay wind slipped through my collar, I realized I felt a little lighter, not because I was freed, but because the final layer of camouflage had been stripped away. I was no longer mistaken for someone who had fallen off. I had been crossed out. I work as an independent inventor and consultant, filing patents, writing modules, licensing usage under contract. No company nameplate required. No fundraising, no stage, no pitches to investors. I work alone, in quiet rooms, with problems hard enough to keep my mind sharp through the night. AI to me is not a slogan. It is structure, constraint, limits that must be compressed so a system can run faster without trading away stability. I file patents regularly, sign cleanly, archive carefully. No one knows my face, and I do not need them to. Then Helen fell ill. The doctors named the disease with a long chain of terms, spoke of rare probabilities, incomplete protocols of time. I listened, asked what needed asking, signed what needed signing. Money left my accounts faster than I expected. But I did not stop. I believe in data, and I believe in extending time when data does not yet permit a conclusion. I sold what could be sold, delayed what could be delayed. I kept working nights and took Helen to treatment during the day. The world narrowed to two tasks, keeping her here and keeping my mind from panic. Helen did not make it. When I returned to my desk, the folders were still there, orderly, cold. The patents granted, the code finished. I had no need to turn them into a story, but the world had other needs. Richard Hale appeared through an intermediary fund. No direct meeting, no grand invitation. A clean offer, limited usage rights to several older patents, priced high enough that I would not have to sell anything else again. I read every clause carefully. Improvement rights remained mine. Scope was tightly defined. Term was clear. On paper, it was a standard transaction. They did not lock me in with clauses. They locked me in with a network. I signed. I retained full rights to improvements, but every legitimate path to bring those improvements into the light was quietly blocked. No rejection letters, not a single negative email. Only calendars already full before I could book time. Drafts suspended indefinitely with polite promises to review later. Responses so courteous they could not be argued with. I understood the mechanism perfectly. Nothing to sue over, nothing to appeal, nothing to prove exclusion, yet it was enough. My name vanished from exchanges, from presentation lists, from every map where decisions were made. After that signature, the phone grew quiet. Emails once answered within a day slipped into weeks. Technical discussions postponed indefinitely. I was not sued, not threatened. I was simply placed outside the circulation loop. Conferences stopped sending invitations. Old research groups stopped mentioning my name. No one said I was wrong. They simply stopped calling. I held the rights to improve, but every door to present those improvements was closed, not with locks, but with full calendars, with "we'll revisit later," with perfect politeness. I understood that system. It leaves no legal trace, yet erases a name from the map. I chose a minimalist life, not from lack of money, but from lack of need to prove anything. I moved to places with fewer eyes, worked in silence, registered what needed registering, archived what needed archiving. I kept my record so clean no one could find me unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. To society, I disappeared. On paper, I was still there. Nights in the library are quieter than boardrooms. The light is even, the desks stable. Time moves to a different rhythm. I keep writing, keep compressing, keep optimizing the things people only care about when costs begin to swell. I do not need applause. I only need the numbers to stand where they belong. So when Victoria said, "I live a simple life," she was not wrong. She just did not understand what that simplicity was built from. I am not poor. I am simply no longer listed in the directories they are used to searching. And in certain places, being crossed out is more effective than any accusation. Being crossed out of the familiar lists doesn't mean I stopped existing. It only changed where I stand. When public doors closed with perfect politeness, I moved to paths with less light, places where work is measured by results, not visibility. I didn't try to crawl back onto the old map. I drew a different line, quiet, tight, and far enough away that no one thought to follow. And in that empty space, conversations they never even suspected began to take shape. The problem with enterprise AI isn't training the model. That part is expensive, but it has an endpoint. What truly burns money is inference. Once the system is deployed, it must respond continuously, millions of queries a day, while latency is forced down as low as possible. For corporations running AI infrastructure at scale, inference cost alone can swallow $15 to $20 million a year for a mid-sized system. If it isn't controlled well, that figure can double in just 18 months. I've watched budgets swell like that, not because users grew, but because each prediction consumed too many resources. If you don't change how inference works, businesses keep paying for redundant computation. evaluation steps that are no longer necessary, but still get executed out of old design habit. I'm not saying this as a theory. I measure it on real load, on response times, on the cloud bill at the end of the month. At scale, shaving even a few percentage points off each query translates into millions of dollars saved per year. And if you don't, that money leaves steadily, quietly, with no one standing up to take responsibility. My solution doesn't change the model, and it doesn't require retraining from scratch. I rebuild the inference layer, reordering evaluation, removing wasted computation, keeping accuracy within an acceptable threshold. The results are measurable. Inference cost drops by 30 to 40%, throughput increases, latency holds steadier under heavy load. For a system burning $20 million a year, that reduction means $6 to $8 million kept every year, starting in the very first cycle. Aurora Systems understood that, so they didn't ask where I came from. They asked whether the numbers would hold. And when the numbers stand where they're supposed to, every other question becomes unnecessary. I don't need to be on a stage to prove value. I only need the problem solved, the money no longer wasted, and the system running smoother than before. The phone vibrated before the sky was fully light, 6:32 in the morning, a time not meant for pleasantries, and certainly not for goodwill. I looked at the screen, saw Victoria's name, and immediately understood the purpose of the call. Not to talk, but to put me in a position where I had to listen. I answered. There was no greeting on the other end. She spoke in a continuous stream, her voice even and firm, like someone accustomed to making decisions for others. The wedding was over. What needed to be displayed in front of the crowd had been done. Now came the remainder, the part without lights, where people believe everything can be handled quickly and cleanly. She said plainly that what happened at the wedding was only the first step to help everyone understand the order of things, and that this call was where that order would be finalized on paper. She talked about the possibility of filing motions, as if pressing the right button would make the machinery run on its own. She spoke of a restraining order, explaining it as if it were merely procedural. Specific distance, clear duration, language that sounded clinical but effective, because a single signature would be enough to turn a father into someone required to stand outside his child's life. She emphasized that, in the current context, filing early would be enough to keep everything stable, and stability in her terms did not include my presence. Then she moved to medical matters, a mental competency evaluation wrapped in the phrase, "for the common good." She did not accuse, did not conclude. She simply described the process. Files, doctors, reports. With those in place, you don't need to prove someone is insane. You only need to make others doubt. I understood this system well. It doesn't need noise, but its consequences linger. She added that in family records, someone who had lived privately, been isolated from the industry, and no longer had a strong social network, was very difficult to counter an initial assessment. Then she turned to Evan. She said my son needed to be protected. That contact at this time was unnecessary. That distance would help everyone stabilize. The way she spoke made severing a father and son sound like a responsible decision, not a slammed door. She cited social pressure, family image, and said directly that my presence was no longer compatible with the position Evan is stepping into. It was cruelty dressed as order. Finally, Victoria made an offer. Her voice slowed, softened like someone dispensing a favor. A monthly payment, enough to live comfortably. The conditions were stated clearly. Sign papers relinquishing my status as a father, commit to not appearing at family events. No direct or indirect contact. She called it a civilized solution, something to make things less complicated. She said quietly that the money was not to buy silence, but to help me withdraw with dignity, because in her view, a proper father is one who knows when to disappear. I listened to everything. I did not interrupt. Not because I was forced, but because I needed to see the entire picture clearly. This call was not meant to frighten me. It was meant to teach me the position they had already prepared. Someone who should disappear neatly, with an allowance, with signatures, with files, and more importantly, someone who no longer had the right to tell his own story. My silence made her impatient. Victoria repeated the offer, this time more specific, as if afraid I hadn't fully grasped the benefits. She said that if I didn't sign voluntarily, everything would still happen, just in a way that was less pleasant for everyone. I looked at the clock, 6:38. I thought about what she was using to threaten me, law, medicine, connections, and about what she had never bothered to check. "I've heard you," I said, my voice low enough not to stir the room. "You've been very clear." She waited for an answer. I let the pause stretch one more beat, not to create tension, but to be sure I spoke from calm. "You should take a closer look at what you're using to threaten me." I ended the call. No argument, no explanation. Some threats don't need to be countered immediately. They only need to be properly noted. The phone lay on the table. Outside the window, the city was beginning to wake. I stood, poured water, opened the door to let the early wind in. The call hadn't frightened me. It clarified their motive, protecting position, image, and control. By erasing me from the equation, it showed me they believed I had nothing left to lose. And when people believe that, they usually go farther than is safe. After the early morning call, I didn't do what they expected. I didn't panic. And I didn't rush to explain myself to Evan. There are moments when explaining only turns you into someone asking permission to exist. I chose something else. I went back to where I had stood for years, a place where no one bowed to me and no one chased me away, where all that was required was that I keep my own order intact. A public library in Palo Alto opens on time. The glass doors slide apart, light as a breath. No one asks who I am. No one needs to know what I used to do. They only check whether I keep my voice low, return books to their place, pull my chair quietly enough not to fracture the silence. I walk in like someone coming home. Not home in the sense of a key, but home in the sense of clear rules, where anyone who respects them is allowed to belong. There are people like me here. Not the same stories, but the same rhythm. A gray-haired man near the east-facing window brings a black notebook every day, writing lines so small it's as if he's stitching time back together. A math student claims the corner table, headphones on, eyes locked to her screen as if the rest of the world were just noise. A librarian moves slowly between the stacks, watching corners the way someone tends a garden meant to stay clean. They don't call me by title. They acknowledge me with familiarity. A nod, a brief glance, a library card scanned with emotion that asks for no proof. I choose a fixed seat, a light-colored wooden table, its surface worn thin by thousands of forearms. An outlet in front of me, steady white light above. No romance, no reverence, just enough to see every character clearly. I open my laptop and begin as always. Check logs, rerun benchmarks, compare results, version by version. The work doesn't need a stage, only patience. My intellectual life has none of the sudden brilliance people like to romanticize. It's a sequence of repeated days, but not dull ones. Every morning brings a question, every afternoon an incomplete answer. I write code like a blade sharpener, quietly, meticulously, accepting that a slight deviation will ruin everything downstream. Some nights I leave the library when the air has turned cold, wrists aching, eyes burning from too much screen time. I cross an empty parking lot, hear dry leaves scrape under my shoes, and remind myself that no one will applaud what I'm doing right now, but it will hold when tested. If anyone asked how I lived through those years, the answer wouldn't be poor or rich. I lived on discipline, on simple meals, on the habit of not abandoning a problem just because I was tired, on keeping a promise to myself that if I'd been pushed away from their banquet table, I would build my own workbench where results are measured by truth. That's where the contrast becomes unmistakable. At waterfront hotels in San Francisco, people spend enormous sums just to make the light hit a dress at the right angle for photographs. They hire orchestras to fill gaps emotion can't cover. They stage an evening like a set, where status is counted in guests and value hangs from wrists, collars, and brand labels. In the Palo Alto Library, I spend nights writing code under straight, uncompromising light. There's no expensive wine, only water and a vending machine at the end of the hall. No congratulations, just the steady rhythm of keyboards, like the heartbeat of people quietly trying to make the world run better, without anyone knowing their names. I've sat in polished boardrooms, watched contracts signed with costly pens, heard people talk about vision as if it were property owned by those in power. What they refuse to admit is that the things their empires rest on are usually born in places like this. Not in ballrooms, not under chandeliers, but at old wooden tables in silence, where no one grants you a position and you have to hold it yourself. I look around the library, a habit whenever I need to remember why I'm doing this. No one here steps on others to stand taller. No one calls anyone disposable. No one needs a crowd to feel important. They just work. And that work is exactly what real companies crave, even if they usually notice it only after paying dearly. I understand why Victoria chose to threaten me with law, with medicine, with connections. She believes the world runs on fear and exclusion. I know another truth. The world runs on people who keep sitting in libraries, writing the code that tomorrow becomes infrastructure, next month becomes product, and one day becomes the thing that forces an entire empire to bow. I shut down my laptop when the lights go off. I push my chair back into place. I nod to the librarian. Outside, there are no fireworks, only cold wind and quiet streets. But inside me, everything is aligned. The early morning call was just noise, and what's actually moving forward is the result. And when you have results, you don't need anyone's permission to enter the game. The morning began like any other, with habits honed smooth by years of repetition. I woke at the usual hour, brewed coffee the familiar way, set the cup on the table, and opened the window. Wind filled the room, carrying the steady sound of a city running itself. Nothing around me had changed. Only one thing was different. Today, what I had prepared for over a long stretch had reached its endpoint. The notice from Aurora Systems arrived earlier than I expected. Brief, restrained, stripped of any decorative language, it simply confirmed that all conditions had been fully met, the final signature recorded, and the transfer of rights officially in effect. The transaction closed exactly as I intended. Clean, sealed, leaving no space for speculation. No press release had been issued, and it would wait. Everyone involved understood why. When the work touches long-term foundations, stability comes before narrative. The legal side was complete. The chain of ownership stood firm, and that was enough. I read through the documents once more, not to hunt for errors, but to confirm for myself that every link sat precisely where it had been placed months earlier. At 10:20 in the morning, the bank notification arrived. A transfer had posted, $78 million, the first tranche released under a closing structure locked in from the start. The number sat clearly on the screen, requiring no annotation. I looked at it the way one looks at a technical milestone, not a reward. The money's role here was simply to confirm that a complex sequence of decisions had been executed in full. I didn't save a screenshot or forward the information to anyone. The confirmation was filed into a folder named Long Ago, then closed. Like sealing a case, once you know everything inside can stand on its own. There was no rush of emotion, no urge to share. I didn't call Evan. Some truths need to stand on their own before they're spoken, and some relationships shouldn't be pulled into a moment when the other person isn't ready to face reality. The rest of the morning passed with familiar tasks. I reviewed a few technical notes, replied to a short email, straightened my desk. The rhythm stayed intact, as if no turning point had just occurred, and that steadiness was the difference. When you no longer have to prove anything, you don't need to make noise. Early in the afternoon, I opened my calendar. I selected an open slot the following week and set the title brief, neutral enough to avoid attention, yet clear enough that the recipient would understand this wasn't a social courtesy. I added no notes and attached no documents, because the substance of the meeting wasn't on paper. It was in what he had been using all this time. Seeing my name reappear after a long absence would be enough for him to understand that this wasn't an introduction, but an accounting of what had been taken and a conversation about how it would be returned. Richard Hale. I sent the invitation. The system confirmed delivery. I didn't wait for an immediate response. Some people need a moment of silence to realize the balance has shifted, and when they do, the way they answer changes. The afternoon moved slowly. Sunlight shifted across the desk. I stood, cleared the cup, shut down the machine. Outside, no one knew what this day meant to me, and there were no congratulations. Real power doesn't need to be named. It only needs to arrive on time. Closing day ended like that, without display, without noise, just one door closing and another opening, quietly, but wide enough to force those who believed I had disappeared to adjust how they see the board. The glass tower of Hale Dynamics stood at the edge of the bay like a declaration. Its facade reflected sky, water, and passers-by, making anyone who entered feel examined from multiple angles. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to impress, but to observe the atmosphere of a place built on power, orderly, cold, and confident enough to believe everything was under control. The reception hall was wide, ceilings high, the scent of new wood mixed with polished metal. Large screens looped familiar slogans about innovation and the future. I gave my name. The receptionist checked the system, then shifted instantly from scripted courtesy to deliberate caution. I was asked to wait in the guest area, where leather chairs were soft enough to make you forget this was not a social visit. Richard Hale appeared exactly on time, quick stride, decisive posture, a prearranged smile. At the wedding, he had looked at me like a misplaced detail. Today, his gaze was different, still measuring, still distant, but now carrying something people used to winning try to hide: curiosity. "Adrian," he said, just familiar enough, "I hear you have something worth my time." "I brought an improvement," I replied, "a version that, if you ignore it, will keep your system burning money in exactly the place you believe is harmless." Richard's mouth twitched slightly. For people who command cash flow, the phrase burning money always lands. He motioned for me to follow. A private elevator took us up. The glass corridor opened onto the bay. The conference room was a transparent block, sealed by thick glass. Every movement visible from outside. Inside were 3 people: in-house counsel, a product manager, and the head of engineering. The engineer, Noah, was not in a suit. Sleeves rolled, a watch strap mark pressed into his wrist. His eyes flicked from me to the briefcase with the wariness of someone who lives by data. Richard didn't waste time. "Present." I set the case on the table and opened it. No logos, no flashy titles. Only charts, numbers, and technical. Descriptions clear enough that anyone who understood could not pretend otherwise. "This is an inference layer improvement," I said. I reordered evaluation steps in the pipeline, optimized memory allocation, removed redundant computation while keeping system stability intact. At scale, operating costs drop, throughput rises, and latency comes down. Richard studied the performance curves. His eyes lit the way they do when someone spots a rare asset. He didn't ask how I did it. He asked the only thing that mattered to him. "What do you want?" "A clean deal," I said, "and you want this before your competitors do." Richard leaned back, fingers tapping lightly on the glass tabletop. The decision came quickly, the habit of someone used to buying expensive things without asking the price. Send it to R&D for audit. I want to know if it's real. Fast. Today? Noah asked again. Today? Richard replied. Noah looked at me. I nodded because I knew Richard would choose to verify immediately once the fear of missing out appeared. And when they opened their own system to confirm value, I would also get what I needed, an answer that could not be denied about whether Hale Dynamics had merely overused its rights or had quietly appropriated technology that never belonged to them in the first place. We moved to the test room. The large screens lit up. Servers spun up. I provided exactly what was necessary. No more, no less. Enough for them to believe I had what they wanted, and enough for them to step into dangerous ground on their own. Noah worked in silence, comparing structures, matching signatures, combing through each module. The command lines moved so fast that to anyone outside the field, they were just streams of characters. I sat still, listening to the steady hum of cooling fans, like the breathing of a system being forced to look back at itself. 2 hours later, Noah stopped. He straightened. His eyes locked onto a string of results. Mr. Hale, he said, I need you in here. Richard stepped in, irritation barely concealed. What is it? Noah rotated the screen. I just compared Hale Dynamics' inference pipeline with Mr. Adrian's improvement. And? Richard asked. 68% of our pipeline is already using this exact improvement. He pulled up module signatures, call graphs, and commit histories, things far too specific to be coincidence without a common source. The room froze. The product manager halted mid-step. The in-house counsel abandoned his relaxed posture. That's not possible, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. Noah opened another comparison panel. This isn't coincidence. It's an internal fork, an internal code branch built on the older licensed version, then augmented with new improvements. Improvements not covered by the usage rights. The in-house counsel stepped forward, scanned the logs quickly, then spoke slowly, clearly. If this is accurate, this is no longer internal optimization. We have used unlicensed improvements, which gives Mr. Adrian grounds to sue Hale Dynamics for intellectual property infringement, including damages covering the entire period the system has been operating unlawfully. No one argued, no one interrupted. The glass-walled room, moments ago bright and pristine, grew heavy, as if each wall were holding a portion of the truth that had just been named. I remained seated. The most important truths are best spoken by engineering and legal, without the injured party having to raise his voice. You wanted a fast audit, I said evenly. You have your audit, and it's fast enough to show you've been using what isn't yours. Richard looked at me, his voice lowered. Adrian, what do you want? I stood, took back my briefcase. I want things put back where they belong, I said, the same way you once believed you could do to me. I walked out. The glass door closed behind me, thin, transparent, and incapable of hiding the fact that from the moment the figure 68% was spoken, the balance had shifted. The next morning I woke in the familiar space. Just enough light, a tidy desk, an unchanged routine. Outside, things were different. Everything began to grow loud in a deliberate way. I didn't need to guess. I knew who had pressed the start button. Victoria didn't seek dialogue. She chose the crowd. From the very first beat, I understood this wasn't an emotional reaction. The timing was too precise. After the meeting in the glass tower, after the technical team had been forced to open the system for inspection, and just before any legal move from me could be anticipated, this wasn't impulsive. It bore the mark of someone who plans their exit before stepping onto the board. The first post went live at 7:12 in the morning. Tightly cropped image, carefully chosen angle, a short headline, Delusional AI Old Man. The caption made no direct accusation, only suggested just enough to plant a feeling that I lived in fantasy, that what I said was the product of age and regret. 10 minutes later, the second post appeared. Failed inventor. A familiar string of social media keywords. Failure, outdated, left behind. She didn't need to point out where I was wrong. She made readers believe I had been wrong for a long time. I watched the posting rhythm and saw the clear division of roles. Victoria made the noise. Someone behind her stayed silent. One person willing to get muddy to stir opinion, another remaining at a distance to preserve legal insulation. That kind of coordination only exists when it's been discussed in advance. Accounts with polished profile photos began sharing. Second-rate tech influencers, people who had never read an audit report but were excellent storytellers, joined in with a tone of pity laced with mockery. Sad, they wrote, an old generation that can't keep up. Some even tagged Evan, dragging my son in as a prop for the narrative being built. Comments scrolled fast. Each line was a small cut, not deep, but dense. He needs a cognitive evaluation. The family should intervene. Young startups shouldn't listen to old men. I didn't read every word. I watched what mattered. Posting times, spread velocity, engagement graphs rising minute by minute. Every post carried clear timestamps, metrics captured carefully, as if someone were building a dossier from the start. That's when the real objective became unmistakable. They didn't intend to beat me with argument. They wanted to strike trust first. Once a person is labeled delusional or failed, even the clearest evidence gets viewed through warped glass. If I entered litigation in that context, I would have to prove I was sane before I could prove I was right. This kind of humiliation doesn't need crude language. It relies on manufactured consensus. All it takes is placing someone in a frame where the crowd completes the rest. It's public humiliation at a refined level, turning a human being into entertainment without naming it as such. I didn't respond. I didn't correct anything. I didn't write a single line. My silence wasn't from lack of words, but because every word at that moment would be twisted. I let the campaign continue. I let the crowd do its work, and I let the system record everything, every post, every share, every malicious click of approval. By noon, an edited clip appeared. Flat narration, old footage, a few quotes stripped of context. Thousands of laughing comments followed. Views crossed 1 million. I logged the time. No excess emotion, just a marker. Victoria pushed another piece under the banner of expert opinion, from an account that had previously received funding from a fund connected to Hale Dynamics. The tone was polite, the objectivity staged, the conclusion vague. The community should be cautious with unverified claims. The frame was complete. I had been placed in a position where I would have to prove my sanity to the public. That was the final move. If I reacted, they would call it instability. If I stayed silent, they would frame it as admission, a trap designed so the person inside always loses, unless they refuse to play by those rules. I turned off the screen, brewed tea, sat down. In my mind, the pieces clicked into place. This campaign wasn't meant to win a debate. It was meant to strip dignity, force me into justification, so that every response became evidence against me. She wanted me angry. I didn't give her that. Through the afternoon, the numbers kept climbing. The spread map traced familiar connections. I archived everything. Every post was a mirror, every share a footprint. I knew their value when placed correctly. By nightfall, the campaign peaked, and I had enough data. The public humiliation had finished its task. No more words were needed. What they said that day would be replayed intact, at a moment they least expected, under light they didn't control. I cleared the desk, closed the notebook. The fight wasn't on the internet. The internet was just where they left their tracks, and I had seen them all. What Victoria released that day didn't disappear when the screens went dark. On the contrary, it went straight into the one place she couldn't control. Her father's company risk management system. As the smear posts hit peak circulation, warning flags began to trigger. not because of my reputation, but because legal exposure was forming minute by minute. Major investors don't read comments, they read charts. And when the charts showed that a person being labeled delusional was also the holder of core patents the company was using, the question stopped being who was right or wrong and became who would be accountable if this entered litigation records. Internal emails went out quietly. Legal advisors demanded urgent review. Unrecorded calls followed one another. Within less than 24 hours, the inevitable happened. The board was forced to convene an off-schedule session, not to protect reputation, not to calm public opinion, but to confront the risk the smear campaign itself had exposed. And so, the next morning, I walked into the glass room at the highest floor, where decisions are only made when every other exit has already closed. The boardroom sat on the top floor, where glass met sky, and the wooden table stretched long enough to suggest that power could be measured in meters. I arrived on time, neither early nor late, because in rooms like this, timing is always a message. The board was nearly all present, their eyes different, yet sharing one trait: caution. The meeting had been called urgently, without press releases or broad invitations. The kind of session convened for only two reasons: money at risk or reputation on the verge of collapse. Hale Dynamics counsel spoke first, standing, straightening his folder, his voice low and measured, trained to sound objective, and he did not look at me as he spoke. The board needs to consider the credibility of Mr. Adrian's recent statements, as there are indications of cognitive inconsistency, he said, noting signs of unstable perception and urging caution before proceeding. The phrasing was careful, no accusation, no conclusion, only a doubt planted large enough to breed fear. A few people shifted in their seats. I remained still because when people attack the person instead of the data, it usually means the data is not on their side. I understand, I said, my voice carrying just enough in the glass room, which is why I brought a few things for the board to assess for itself. I opened my briefcase without haste or theatrics. The first document placed on the table was a patent registration, the number, filing date, and chain of ownership clearly visible. I slid copies toward the board members, offering little explanation because numbers speak on their own. The second document was a transaction confirmation from Aurora Systems. No flashy logo, just signatures and legal seals, stating plainly that the acquisition of improvement exploitation rights had been completed and the transaction value confirmed. I did not read it aloud. I let them read. The third document was the internal R&D report, the very report Noah had completed, with comparison charts, red marked sections, and a clear conclusion that the majority of the pipeline was operating on unlicensed improvements. No emotion, only results. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to reclaim the rhythm, and said I was attempting to distract the board with paperwork, insisting that the issue was my credibility. I nodded exactly, and that is why I brought this. I turned on the screen, and the room's light shifted with the frames of a short video. Victoria's voice rang out clearly, uncut and unedited. He's delusional, a failed inventor. The posting time, view count, and source were visible in the corner. I paused the video on that line. This is a public assessment of me, I said, circulated before this meeting, used to shape opinion, and issued by someone with direct ties to the company's chairman. No one spoke. The air thickened, like a door closing without sound. One board member set his pen down. Another stared at the documents longer than necessary. The lawyer no longer stood. He sat with his hands clasped. Because in rooms like this, silence is not emptiness. It is acknowledgement forming. Richard Hale, who had leaned back in his chair until then, rose slowly, his movement unhurried and untheatrical, scanning the table and then looking at me, his eyes stripped of their familiar confidence and carrying something heavier, awareness of consequence. He bowed his head, not deeply and not long, but enough to be seen, enough to force those who had thought I was merely a name erased from the map to recalibrate. "I'm sorry," Richard said quietly, "for what happened and for what was allowed to happen." There was no applause, no reaction. In that glass room, power shifted without announcement, and the humiliation was not in the apology, but in the fact that a man accustomed to standing above had to lower himself before evidence produced by his own system. I gathered my papers and closed the briefcase. "Thank you for your time," I said. "The rest will be handled by the law." I walked out as the glass door closed behind me. Inside, they remained, facing a new reality, and I, for the first time in a long while, left a boardroom without needing to look back. After the emergency session, there was no explosion. Large structures rarely collapse in plain sight. They begin with small fractures, appearing in late-night calls, in lawyers' voices that sound less certain, and in emails longer than usual, where every sentence carefully avoids a truth that can no longer be avoided. Negotiations opened under a word that sounded gentle: settlement. But behind it stood two issues that sealed off every other path: intellectual property infringement and intentional defamation. When those two sit in the same file, people stop debating right and wrong and start discussing where to stop so the damage doesn't spread further. Hale Dynamics' legal counsel changed tone completely. The vague phrasing once used to plant doubt disappeared, replaced by the language of risk control. Limit exposure, stabilize shareholders, preserve what remains. I listened without interruption because when denial gives way to calculation, it means the final boundary has already been crossed. The agreement was built in layers. Intellectual property came first. Hale Dynamics formally acknowledged using improvements beyond the scope of the original license, with no explanations, no process blame, signatures appearing simply because every alternative led to a courtroom whose outcome they could not control. Damages were calculated based on revenue generated from that technology, plus legal costs and non-recurrence provisions, the figure large enough that no one in the room asked another question. The defamation followed as an inseparable consequence. Posts, videos, and public statements were listed chronologically, each paired with reach metrics, partnership impact, and downstream corporate risk. No one argued motive, because in these rooms, motive matters less than measurable consequence. Takedown, correction, and compensation clauses passed faster than expected. Reputation, once entered onto a balance sheet, always has a price, and usually a higher one than people assume. But money was only the first layer. To meet remediation requirements and reassure the market, several partners and banks reevaluated IP risk, tightened financing terms, and forced the sale of the most dispute-prone segment, the one once seen as the growth engine. The decision wasn't loudly announced, but anyone watching could sense the urgency behind it. When an asset is pushed into a sale, it loses its greatest advantage: time. The deal closed below expectations, leaving a gap that showed up not only on financial statements. It was in that gap that Richard Hale began disappearing from meetings, first through delegations, then absences with reasons, until one morning a statement was issued, carefully worded, responsible in tone, citing the company's long-term interests and opening a new chapter. It mentioned neither me nor the glass-walled meeting, but everyone who had been in that room understood why that chair could no longer be held. Richard was not dragged down. He stood up and left, because staying would have meant every future decision forever examined under the shadow of what had occurred. Some power ends not in public humiliation, but in prolonged silence, the kind that tells you your time has passed. The consequences spread into social life faster than I expected. Invitations that once arrived for Victoria began thinning. Events where her presence had been assumed quietly dropped her name from the list. No one criticized her. No articles attacked her. The isolation happened in the coldest way possible. People simply stopped wanting to stand in the same frame. She didn't lose money. She lost something else. Position. In circles where image and connection are currency. Being removed from the network cuts deeper than any number. I didn't track every step of that descent. I received final confirmations, reviewed terms, and signed the closing pages. There was no sense of victory or defeat, only the clarity of a chain of actions reaching proportionate consequence. A sentence spoken before a crowd may last seconds, but once recorded, spread, and weaponized, it carries responsibility beyond the speaker's control. The cost doesn't arrive when the sound is made. It arrives later, in closed rooms, on unadorned paper, and in decisions that cannot be undone. When everything concluded, I left my desk later than usual, the city lights already on, stepping outside with the same rhythm I'd kept all along. Some endings don't need celebration. They only need to be passed through, lighter than before because what needed to be set down has finally been placed where it belongs. After everything, what remained was not the signed settlements or the titles removed from glass doors. What remained was silence, the kind that doesn't come from strategy, but from someone realizing they stood still too long when they should have stepped forward. Evan came to see me one afternoon without an appointment, without warning, without a prepared opening. The way he stood outside the door showed he had been there a while, long enough to consider turning away. When I opened it, he didn't step inside immediately. He looked down at the floor as if searching for a small point of balance to begin. I stayed silent, Evan said, his voice low. No justification, no detours. And I let that silence work in my place. He sat, hands resting on his knees, gripping them as if to keep them from shaking. Evan spoke of months spent being pulled between unnamed standards, needing to look successful, to stand in the right line, to avoid anything that might damage the image. Victoria never had to shout. She used soft sentences, repeated often enough, to turn doubt into belief. Dad can't keep up. Dad will make us look bad. Silence is how we protect both sides, each sentence light on its own, but stacked together heavy enough to make resistance feel selfish. Evan admitted that fear of status made him shrink, fear of being excluded from the circle, fear of becoming the son of a past, fear of losing what he had just touched. And in that fear, he chose the easiest path, stepping aside, pretending nothing was happening. He said this not to be forgiven, but to name the thing that had kept him quiet. "I'm sorry," Evan said, and this time he looked straight at me, not seeking reaction, not asking to be soothed, just placing the words between us and letting them carry their own weight. I didn't answer immediately, not from hesitation, but because some words need time to settle. I said that an apology doesn't erase the moments already gone, but it opens the possibility of not repeating them, and that atonement, if it exists, isn't in language, but in how a person stands when no one is pushing them anymore. Evan nodded. He understood. The divorce didn't happen like a clean cut. No rushed filings. No dramatic declarations. Everything moved slowly, at the pace required to untangle bindings. Finances, schedules, conversations that weren't easy. Evan didn't run. He stayed to resolve things piece by piece, like someone willing to walk the entire road he had entered. There were days he called not to ask advice, just to say that today had been hard, but finished. There were long silences between calls that no longer meant abandonment, but space to stand on one's own. I didn't hover, I didn't direct, I held my position, a point of support without intrusion. The visit ended simply. Evan stood slower than when he arrived. At the door he paused without turning back. "I won't stay silent any more," he said, not a promise to me, but to himself. When the door closed, I sat for a while longer. There was no sense of victory, only the lightness of a knot untied the right way. Some acts of atonement don't need an audience. They happen quietly, but last longer than any oath. And in that quiet, I knew there are stories that don't end with someone falling, but with someone learning how to stand upright again, this time without borrowing another person's silence to shield their own fear. After all the noisy doors had closed, what remained wasn't the echo of victory. It was a space wide enough to see clearly what I wanted to do next, not to prove anything, not to rebut anyone, but to restore order in a more durable way. I established an AI education fund on an ordinary morning. No launch event, no speech. The paperwork was filed cleanly. The mission stated plainly: to support foundational AI training for people pushed to the margins, older professionals labeled out of sync, engineers displaced by restructuring, students without the connections to enter closed rooms. The program promised no glamour. It offered practical knowledge, disciplined thinking, and access to the right resources. I chose instructors accustomed to working in silence, people who understood the value of standing firm rather than standing tall. The fund ran like a diligent system: small but steady scholarships, short but deep courses, rigorous evaluation with no favoritism. Participants entered without labels and left with measurable capability. I didn't put my name on a plaque, didn't appear in photos. The reports I received contained only numbers, progress, and questions to be solved. That was enough. There was nothing for the media to latch onto. No central figure, no comeback story to retell. I kept my distance because I'd learned something simple. Attention distorts the work. When the spotlight moves on, good work finally has room to stand. Some asked why I didn't use the moment to speak one more time. I didn't answer because everything that needed to be said had already been said through contracts, audits, and results. Words are only necessary when the truth isn't clear enough. Occasionally, I received handwritten letters, brief, unadorned, someone finishing the first course and finding a job, a small team optimizing their system and saving enough that their company didn't have to lay off anyone else. I read them, folded them, and placed them in a drawer. Those letters didn't need a public reply. They had already arrived where they belonged. In the evenings, I returned to my familiar rhythm: a clean desk, sufficient light, the city outside continuing its noise in its own way. I neither stood outside to criticize nor stepped in to compete. I stayed where I belonged, where work gets done properly. If I were to leave behind a single line, I wouldn't choose a new one. I'd keep the old, because it already says everything that needs saying. The loudest room laughed at me. The quietest contract paid me. And that is where it closes. No applause needed. No validation required. Only silence placed in the right spot, where it produces value. If you've walked with me this far, you likely understand one thing: justice doesn't always arrive with shouting, and real value rarely lives in the loudest place. There are people laughed at in public who later rise quietly where no one is looking, and it's there that they reset the balance. If this story made you pause for a beat, rethink silence, dignity, or how someone chooses to stand upright without raising their voice, leave a "So I know you're here," and if you want to continue listening to stories where the truth doesn't need to shout to endure, I'd appreciate a follow. Tell me where you're listening from. We'll meet again in the next chapter of stories not meant for the hurried.